Okay, hi all, and good morning. My name is Walter Diaz. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I am new here, so I'm still learning names. Well, not that new anymore. I started in September, so I'm still learning all the names of all the principals, even here. It's very exciting to have you all here. This is the sixth annual research conference for our college, and we're doing something new this year in terms of having a thematic focus on it, and we're hoping that this will be the first of many exciting innovations that will help us grow and expand while maintaining our roots in the community, but with branches that reach out to the rest of the country and hopefully in the future to the whole world. We're very excited about this. I want to show my appreciation to the visitors who are here with us, like Dr. Michael Montoya, who's here with us from University of California at Irving, Dr. Rocío Magaña, who's with us from Rutgers, Juanita Sundberg from the University of British Columbia. Also want to show my appreciation to all the people who have been involved in setting this up. Dr. Miguel Diaz-Barriga, Dr. Jessica Lavariega, who play very critical roles. We have Dr. Montgomery, who's here with us from the Dean's office. He's one of our assistant deans. He's been working very hard with us. The whole Dean's staff has worked very, very much on this. And I want to particularly point out the work of Monica Denny, who has played a key role in all this. So without much more ado, I welcome you all. Thank you for being here, and I leave you with Dr. Miguel Diaz-Barriga, who's going to introduce the speaker. Thank you so much.
It is truly a joy and a pleasure to introduce one of the rising stars of border studies in the United States. And indeed, if Dr. Rocío Magaña represents the future of border studies, then that future is indeed bright. I first met Dr. Magaña personally, although had heard a lot about her work and managed to get some of it, long story there, but through some University of Chicago connections, at a conference at Emory University on the rule of law in Mexico, where we participated in a panel together. And ever since then, it seems that our paths have crossed multiple times. We both worked together on the Association for Latino and Latina Anthropologists, and we were also participants in a panel on borders, walls, and mobilities, which was a presidential section of the American Anthropological Association. So I also see this as part of our continuing relationship and growth as scholars. So, Rocío, thank you so much for coming to UTPA. I know it's a long trip, and we really thank you for your presence here. Now, let me just say a few words about Dr. Magaña's credentials, if you will. She is a BA from California State Fresno, 2001. And she went from California State at Fresno to the University of Chicago, which, in my mind at least, had to be a huge jump. And I asked Dr. Magaña about that. She says, yep, I wasn't in Kansas anymore. Where she graduated with a PhD in anthropology in 2008. She's currently an assistant professor of anthropology at Rutgers in New Brunswick. She has numerous publications, including a book project on deaths in the Arizona border, a publication, Deadly Displays of Border Politics, and she has a publication, Desolation Bound, Enforcing America's Borders on Immigration Bodies, which won the Ignacio Martín Baró Human Rights Essay Prize at the University of Chicago. And for those of you who are not familiar with Ignacio Martín Baró, he was a Salvadoran liberation theologian who's known throughout the world for his work. She's won numerous prizes and fellowships, including the American Anthropological Association Minority Dissertation Fellowship, the Kurt Landgraf Outstanding Dissertation Award from the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, the Sol Tax Dissertation Prize from the University of Chicago, and she was at the National Center for Institutional Diversity Research at the University of Michigan. Dr. Magaña's work is not only relevant for us here in South Texas, obviously being in a border area, but for the rest of the country. As we see what I believe are the erosion of civil liberties and human rights on the border, one has to wonder out loud, at what point will this start extending, and indeed I believe it is already extending, to the rest of the country. So as Dr. Diaz said, this research speaks not only to the border, but what's going on in the United States as a whole, and I would argue even internationally, as we see the proliferation of border walls and border security measures, for example, in Europe and other parts of the world. So with that, I would like to present Dr. Magaña. I don't want to take your paper.
Yeah, leave my paper here. And I don't need that anymore. So thank you, Miguel. First of all, I want to thank the University of Texas Pan American for holding us, for inviting me, and inviting all of us. This is a fantastic chance to play with the microphone, to have a conversation on borders, and I'm really looking forward to this. I would like to thank the Dean, Walter Diaz, the Assistant Dean, Jessica Lavariega, and the staff for doing what's obviously a fantastic job. I have a few names here: Monica Diaz, Blanca Alemán, Juanita Peña, Jessie Medina. Thank you. This, I mean, from doing little name tags and putting the tilde and the accent over names, I mean, this takes a lot of your work. Thank you, and thanks to all of the students and the brigades of people who put posters all over campus. I can only imagine the kind of work. And thank you to Miguel for the invitation. I do have to say that Miguel really underplayed the conference. So he said, do you want to come and talk to us about your current work? And I'm like, yeah, my current work. So let me present some work in progress. And I was talking to Michael Montoya last night. It's like, we know the fallacy of presenting work in progress. These are ideas that are still congealing, and I hope that maybe together we can think about them, and we can think through what is it that it means to, for instance, criminalize water, as we think about ways of really taking this notion that we have of the border beyond the idea that the border is a line or a wall. I mean, really thinking about the social apparatus that makes the border powerful and so effective, right? So, so with that, I'm gonna present this talk that is still evolving and changing, and it is called, for the moment, Criminalizing Water: The Battles Over Protection of Migrant Life, Wildlife, and Humanitarian Rights in the Arizona-Mexico Border. First parenthesis, too early. And I owe this to Roger Diaz, Native American scholar out of the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He tuned me in just a couple of weeks ago. I presented this in Berlin, a rougher version of this still. And he said, you really need to think about water. And what is water in this field? And he recommended that I read Jamie Linton's book, What is Water? And Jamie Linton opens the book with this very nifty, pithy sentence: water is what we make of it. And I'd like us to think about that in the context of the border. So what is it that we're making of water in the border? What is the role that water is playing as we negotiate this social relation that we have with the other, that the border crosser, the unauthorized border crosser, is in the American social and legal system? A couple of ideas from this book. So very briefly, what I want you to get out of this is this idea that he's interested in the social nature of water. He says, it's not that society produces water per se, but that every instance of water that has significance for us is saturated with ideas, meanings, values, and potentials that we have conferred upon it. So this sense that, that water, as significant as we talk about it, is definitely a social construct. It has a social nature. And then he wants us to think more critically about what he calls hydrosocial relations. This is, his argument is mostly about, thinking about the water crisis as a global phenomenon and how that is a social construct. And borrowing this idea of hydrosocial relations to the US-Mexico border, I'm really interested in thinking about this question of who has the right to water, who has the right to place water, and what are these water politics that are being played out in the Arizona desert, a gallon of water at a time. So I begin. It is 3:30 in the morning when I drive up to Michael's house. He greets me with a smile as he loads the wheelbarrow onto the bed of his forest green pickup and secures it carefully onto the double-layered gallon of size of water jugs. There are 224 of them. He's ready to go. This time I got a shovel, he says, pointing to it, referring to our last trip together when his truck had gotten stuck onto a sandbank. Eventually, two Tohono O'odham tribal members drove up the road and pulled us out, but not before a long exchange of stares. Mike and I knew that meant trouble. As a tribal member, Mike is the only person, at least at that time, who was willing and able to maintain water stations in tribal land, which he did despite the opposition of the tribal council and the mixed feelings of many of his fellow O'odham. He made the rules clear. As his guests, I, like other people, we were there to watch and keep in company. Mike always did all the work. His stations bore his distinctive orderly mark, bottles arranged in perfect square formations in perfect cardinal alignment. Strategically positioned jugs were marked, que Dios lo bendiga, God bless you. He wanted migrants to know that the water had been intentionally left for them as a Samaritan gesture. During the first year of the migratory shift into the desert, and I will go into that in a moment, the land of the Tohono O'odham became ground zero for migrant death, a fact that motivated this retired army man in his 50s to wake up way before dawn each Saturday, load up his truck with water and supplies, and drive west towards the most desolate parts of the desert, in this case, just the Tohono O'odham land. With the influx of migrants and their deaths in O'odham land, also came a deluge of other actors, the feds, humanitarians, the media, etc. The tribe soon opted for keeping out as many of these people as they possibly could, but Mike Works and his steady stream of guests did not help matters. Obviously, you can imagine the storylines, right? I mean, Mexicans dying on tribal land, unauthorized immigrants dying on tribal land. So there was no way to actually have a positive spin about this. And it was also localized for the Tohono O'odham in a way that did not do them justice to the fact that all of a sudden their land was also being, flooded with this new problem, right? But Mike would not desist. He had been threatened and ostracized, but that did not stop him. Neither critique or sabotage seemed to break his spirit, which was a good thing, particularly that morning, because with the exception of one, all of his water stations had been vandalized. The damage was evident as soon as we would drop into the first station. Someone had driven an all-terrain vehicle, it seemed like, over 80-some jugs that he had placed there just a week before. At another station, the jugs had been punctured or slashed. Mike inspected each of the plastic bottles, finding some relief in the ones that showed marks from Javelin's teeth. At other water stations, Mike's bottles, where he found some jugs with brownish water marked El Saguaro. They had El Saguaro tags. The jugs came from Mexico, and Mike's joy was evident. See those 5 jugs there? This is why I do this. See that brown water? This means that someone doesn't have to drink that, he said to me enthusiastically. Quote, as long as people get water, it doesn't matter to me if they mess with my stations, he added, but it did matter. From their inception, water stations aimed at minimizing migrant deaths in the desert offer a battleground to dispute and affirm the role of civilian intervention in this landscape of migrant suffering and death that the desert had become. Typically, humanitarian groups took these petty trials on stride. Gunned down barrels were simply replaced, slashed jugs were traded for new ones. If a station was vandalized repeatedly or too frequently, it was just moved further into the desert, forcing saboteurs to hike and out themselves out in the process. Hopefully, ideally, at least, make it a bit more difficult for them. Many suspected law enforcement officials were behind some of these acts, conjectures often link Border Patrol agents and Tohono O'odham police to particular kinds of damage in areas too remote or inaccessible for most Arizonans. The real challenge for these actors, however, was yet to come, and it would be open and indirect, and it would have to be settled in court. This is some of the social aspects of this, right? I mean, so obviously these groups had been challenged for their actions. They've been called all kinds of names or continuous death threats, the kind of stuff that comes with the possibility of anonymity and in the immigration debate in the U.S. So in my talk today, I hope to offer you an ethnographic analysis that is still in progress of how water and its dispensation in the border regions has been mobilized to contest and determine who has the right to police and protect, what deserves protection or more protection, and on what grounds. In what follows, I trace the developments of a legal case through which humanitarian groups attempted to inscribe their migrant saver labor as a recognizable right. As water drops in protected wildlife areas. I'm sorry, I'm missing a sentence here. So I look at how the water drops in contested or in protected wildlife areas where migrants are known to be dying came under legal challenge. It also became an opportunity for these activists and humanitarians to denounce border and immigration politics that result in hundreds of deaths by fatigue, dehydration, and hypothermia each year. So by looking at how it is that the protection of life, in this case wildlife, was prioritized over the protection of human lives, these activists hope to put the federal in an interesting position to have to argue a politics of life as enacted on the desert. So. But there's something else, right? However, as I show, in the process of upholding the idea of a right to humanitarian intervention, migrants and their vulnerable bodies also become a sort of condition of possibility for the articulation of citizen rights and state authority in these marginal terrains. So if you can claim that you have a right to save lives, it also presupposes that there must be someone out there who would need that kind of saving. So I'm interested in what is it that articulation creates in the domain of not only of politics of otherness, but also as a way of creating a different kind of border, right? A legal boundary that separates those who have rights and those whose lives can be threatened and come under risk. So as I weave together the complexities of this case, my goal is to explain how water, as life-saving, polluting, or incriminating, is mobilized within legal, political, and moral regimes to contest and claim rights in ways that ultimately reproduce the border's capacity to exclude, expose, and let die. But before we do that, I need to give you some background. So let me talk about briefly how it is that we got to a point in which this contest over, who can come, who can leave, got to be fought out on the basis of water, little water jugs, right? I mean, we're talking about very, very small jugs at the time. So, this map, this comes from the 1994 Border Patrol strategy. And although migration to the US from Mexico is something that, precedes the boundary, and that the way that we have it has become systematically, actually for the last 35 years or so, the CIA estimates that about 500,000 people from Mexico cross into the US to work every year. It's been stable. It varies according to economic crisis and fluctuations, right? If there are no jobs here, people don't cross. It's been historic. But, as the economy improves, people will continue to come. I'll show you some numbers in a moment. The problem begins to happen as broadcast TV becomes to find the border story a really interesting trope to deploy, right? So as this migration becomes more visible, it becomes a problem, and it's a problem that needs to be tackled. But the problem is not necessarily to solve the migration, to stop it, but to intervene on it, to shape it, to do something about it. So we have, obviously, in 1986, we have IRCA, which definitely changed the way that we thought about immigration, right? So the idea was that illegal immigration could undermine the basic possibility of the nation. So we needed to do something about it. But the idea was not necessarily to do what we needed to do about it, which is a way of rendering this immigration manageable, right? I mean, so if we know specifically that 500 people come and work, and it means that 500,000 people every year, find jobs and send money back, and there are plenty of studies that prove that this is both stable and beneficial to both economies, why refuse to manage it in a way that would, make this immigration, a open book kind of governmental intervention? It is very profitable to keep it this way. But let me tell you then a couple of other things. So in 1986 happened. There was a mandate to secure the border. So obviously you cannot secure the border overnight. So we've had a series of other regulations to do this. So then we had the famous operation, what has been called Operation Gatekeeper, which is a part of the 1994 Border Patrol strategy, which basically said, I'm going to show you, and I don't have all the things. But the idea, and then there's South Texas, that by blockading specific traditional ports of entry, You know, in the traditional ports of entry, you know, were Tijuana, San Diego, El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and then, you know, cities, basically, right? We would increase the window of time in which we could detain people. The strategy was called Operation Through Deterrence. And at the face value, the idea was that we would make it so difficult to cross that people would just stop coming, right? So how difficult can you make it? We'll make it very, very difficult. So, and to make it difficult, it meant, you know, moving the unauthorized migratory flows away from ports of entry, away from cities. So how did that change migration? Well, migration went from something in which you could jump a fence and pretend to be a shopper, you know, walk a little, I mean, just walk around the fence, you know, it would take you, you know, about a mile and then you would be back. Something that would last between, you know, 2 minutes and 2 hours. To now something that lasts, you know, 3, 4, 5 days and is repeated multiple times. So there are people who are in the process of crossing for months. So, so this in the late 1990s, we began to see this funneling on migration into the Sonoran Desert. Was this the first time that we saw migration into Sonoran Desert? No, not really. There was, in 1881, there was a group of 18 Salvadorians who died trying to cross this desert, right? I mean, trying to find a way out of, you know, political persecution. In the mid-1800s, a lot of miners from Mexico died crossing this desert in their way to California, right? I mean, a lot of miners from Chile and whatnot. So this is a place that is known to kill. And this is a place where we shifted a massive funnel migration, very effective. So the window of time in which you could detain someone went from a few minutes or a couple of hours to now days, right? So you had 3 days to stop someone, and you're in the middle of the desert, you're triggering sensors, you're on this trail. So the option is, do I stop you today? Do I stop you in the next hour? Do I let the guy in the next shift stop you? I know where you're gonna be tomorrow. I know where you're gonna be the next day. So, so enforcement in this part of the border doesn't take place on the boundary line. It takes place near the roads. So this makes it very, very effective for a very small group of agents, 2, 3, 4, to detain groups of 40 men. They wake them up. It's like, hey, game over, come on, you know, get up, it's time to go. So a lot of the migrants who are repatriated were basically, you know, they walk 3, 4 days, they get detained, and they're, you know, funneled back into the Mexican side of the border where they will cross again. Every time they're detained, and they're photographed, and they're bussed, and they're given a little bit of water, they generate a lot of income for some of the companies that have now begun, you know, to enter the border enforcement part of this policy. So just some numbers and some interesting trends. So this is removals in the US, and it's hard to see, but you obviously can see the overall trend. The bar that is kind of lower next to that is basically border enforcement. It's removals along the boundary. So for the long time, I mean, the idea was that if you can make it across the boundary, you are basically home free, right? The interestingly disturbing trend is the little bars in the bottom, which is internal repatriations. And obviously, to be able to do this kind of internal repatriations, you need infrastructure. And once you establish the infrastructure, now you have an active business, and you need to continue to do that. So, so although technically, and this is up to 2008, so it doesn't have the drop in migration that we've seen in the last couple of years following the current crisis, and also the problem with violence along the boundary. But pretty stable patterns, right? So we have, and although, and I must say that these are on the border, these are events. These are, you know, deportation events. It's technically voluntary repatriation events. It doesn't mean people. So someone, and I've met people who've been, you know, repatriated 12 times in the process of a month. In the records, it will appear as 12 people, not as just a single person, right? I mean, so this really kind of inflates the statistics. We, at the highest moment of crossing in the desert, it was believed that about, you know, 300,000 people walk across the desert multiple times to make it across. So how does this look on the ground? This is, and I don't have a pointer, but so Tohono Reservation, where Mike drops water, is brown, it's in the center, it's the size of the state of Connecticut, which I think is the common reference to talk about small, you know, regions that are big enough but small enough to, you know, deserve state. Now I've seen it in a few places. It's like, oh, it's interesting. Connecticut, you know, comes into the imaginary. And so this is a map of 2004. It has 224 deaths. You can see that so there's death in the Tohono. In green, you have national wildlife preserves of different denominations. In blue, you have state land trust, which is where a lot of people who migrated. Also, Arizona is a place where 2 migrations and kind of confront each other. So you have a migration coming from the north of retirees, snowbirds, who, you know, dreamt of having a ranch and some cattle out north, and they found some cheap land, and lo and behold, it happened to be next to the border. And then, you know, and then you have this migration from Mexico. So that's really what makes some of this politics really kind of terrible and interesting to watch. So this is a landscape, and in gray you have a bombing range. How many people live in a bombing range? No one, right? Population density on what is called the Western Desert, which is basically west of Tucson. Most that area between the Tohono O'odham and the bombing range is less than a person per square mile. So this is a map that has the number of bodies recovered from the desert, not all the people who died, but the bodies that were found by 2007. And this is a map of the bodies found by 2009. So we don't have the ones that have, you know, the last 400 bodies. But we can talk about the politics of mapping, but not in the Q&A. But this is basically the background for this, for this kind of activism, right? So how is it that water became something to, you know, contest politics on the basis of, well, when you have people dying mostly from dehydration and exposure, the idea was that, you know, maybe we could provide a little bit of water. We could intervene in this landscape. Does it save lives? Yes, it does. Does it save everyone? No, it doesn't. Is it symbolic? Yeah, absolutely, right? So this is the background. So then let me turn to, so in the United States, the activities of humanitarian groups in the border deserts have brought water to trial. On July 2008, Daniel Mills was found guilty, and Daniel is not in this photo, but I'll show him in a second, of littering in the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge. On February 22nd, 2008, the No More Deaths volunteer and former high school teacher and currently working for the Sierra Club was cited by a Fish and Wildlife officer for placing gallon-sized water jugs in migrant trails along Brown Bear Canyon, about 20 miles north of the boundary with Mexico. Just 2 days before his citation, Dan had stumbled upon the body of Jocelyn Hernandez, a 13-year-old girl from El Salvador. Jocelyn suffered from cramps so intense she was not able to keep walking. Severe dehydration causes an electrolyte imbalance that produces painful and paralyzing muscular cramps, which are the harbinger of organ failure and the body's total collapse. Each year, some 200 to 300 bodies of unauthorized border crossers are recovered from throughout southern Arizona. Estimates vary, but must place the regions that tally over 2,000 for the past 10 years. Some people would say that it's as high as 10,000. It's really impossible, and the politics of counting are also kind of interesting. Although no one knows the exact number of people who die trying to make it across through these terrains, there is no single agency that is actively looking for the dead. No one keeps accurate counts. What is certain, however, is that tens of thousands of people enter this desert and enter the desert across this region. It is certain that the average number of days and number of attempts that it takes to actually cross into the U.S. have increased as enforcement becomes tighter, and certain of its components private. It is also certain that the summer temperatures can stay over 100 for days and even reach 170 in some spots, and this is through, you know, the topographic composition of some basins. It is certain that it is virtually impossible to carry the amount of water one would need for the 3 to 5 day hike in such conditions, some 60 to 80 pounds worth of fluid. And we do know with absolute certainty that most of these deaths are due to hypothermia and dehydration. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that water was the first response from concerned local citizens to what some have called the border's humanitarian crisis, believing that it was, quote, unacceptable to have people dying from thirst in our backyard. Humane Borders was formed in the year 2000 with the explicit mission to make life-saving water available in remote areas of the desert. The organization currently maintains over 100 water stations. Each of them has 65 gallons of water barrels, and they have a 30-foot pole with a flag. And they can be found in private property, municipal and state trust land. They have also been formally permitted in some wildlife refuges and parks. The barrels are not enough. Migrant deaths are on the rise, and the bodies were being found in. So the barrels were obviously not enough. They have never been. And as migrant deaths were on the rise and bodies were found in other areas that were mostly accessible by foot, humanitarians formed other organizations and responded with other strategies. And to make a long story short, No More Deaths was formed, and it's formed in 2003, and its volunteers began to cover the desert for days and weeks, and some of them for months, armed with food, water, blister kits, and various degrees of medical skills. And I should say various degrees of Spanish, too. For the most part, these groups launched, for the most part, since the beginning, this group's launch was an open and transparent campaign, and they had mostly cordial relations with various law enforcement agencies. When you're on the roads with them, so there are stories of people, getting tires changed by Border Patrol agents. I was detained by the same agents a few times. They stopped me and like, hi. So there's this interesting of like, we're out here in the desert, right? So there's a sense of some of that to some degree. Obviously, when you have new agents, things are more complicated. But things have changed as a result of constant media attention and the influx of newcomers among all parties, rookie agents, non-local volunteers, private industry, new smuggling, and cartel dynamics. So the relationship that the initial volunteers had with the locals has been strained, and this also translated into the arrest in 2005 of two of No More Deaths' youngest volunteers while medically evacuating 3 migrants with various degrees of heat stroke symptoms. So those 2 arrests, and we can talk about them in a moment, allowed these organizations to begin to articulate a legal campaign. So the idea was to create a precedent to prove that providing humanitarian aid humanitarian aid was a right. And so this began the Humanitarian Aid is Never a Crime campaign. So the surprise, 3 years later when Dan Millis was arrested, was cited for littering, was not that some kind of law enforcement would challenge them, but actually how the challenge would take place. So the surprise then was that the charge was littering. After years of having thousands of volunteers pass out and place thousands upon thousands of gallons of water to try to avert migrant deaths, and after having picked up and recycled literally many more thousands of empty bottles and innumerable pounds of trash and debris left behind by migrants, these activists were cited for littering out of all things. As proof, Fish and Wildlife officers offered photographs, and so let me. Actually, some of these images are new for this morning. This is in the previous one. So this is so Dan Millis kept a blog, right? And so the day that he is cited, he's like, "Hi again. Yesterday, after several hours of picking up trash near the border, I was given 175 citation for littering. This place is unbelievable." I should say that Dan works now for the Sierra Club, which has been always kind of interesting in this, and he's running their border campaign. So. He went to trial, and he could have paid the fine. Actually, he was given community service or the option, and he said, "No, I'm not going to pay this fine because I was not littering the desert. I was placing water for migrants." So he was found guilty, and he received a sentence in a memorandum that was sent to his attorney. And the memorandum basically said that he had found guilty of a Class B misdemeanor offense of littering in a national wildlife refuge. And the sentence has been suspended. So he basically said, so the federal government has found me guilty of a crime for which there is no punishment. So what does this make of leaving water out for migrants, right? I mean, and the question was never, does this water save lives? All parties involved in the negotiation agreed. And I'm going to read you some of that stuff. So, and this photos actually come from the exhibit, from actually the court case. So here I would like to turn to the specific language of the trial, and I will offer you, the actual outcome at the end. And this is appeal. So he's found guilty, in the U.S. District Court, and he appeals to the U.S. District Court, and the court, upholds the verdict. So then he appeals to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and this is a conversation of the hearing. So here I would like to turn to the specific language of the trial and its appeal, and to focus on two interrelated questions. First, how water drops and their legal challenge fit within the humanitarian activities and visions of these border groups. And perhaps more consequential, how can water, which the government readily recognizes as valuable and life-saving, can nevertheless be construed as garbage? This is from the reading. This is actually... So here we have a couple of things from the trial. So this is from the final outcome. So Dan Millis concedes that placing water on he placed water on refuge trails, but argues that his conduct did not violate section 27.94a because the bottles of purified water did not constitute, quote, garbage, refuge, sewage, sludge, earth, rocks, or other debris, which is the legal definition of garbage, right? Within the meanings of the regulation. The United States counters that bottles constitute garbage. So that was the position of the U.S. government. So there is a whole debate as to what are we talking about? How can we think of water as a way to deal with garbage? So here's the actual hearing. So this is during the trial. Dan Millis was questioned about his reasons for leaving water in these trails. At one point, he stated that it had never been his intention to, quote, litter in the wildlife refuge, but rather to provide aid in the form of clean drinking water for migrants. The statement prompted the following exchange between Judge Bernardo Velasco when he was hearing the case initially. So this is Velasco. Mr. Millis, you said that humanitarian aid is never a crime. That's true, Your Honor. Millis. Velasco, is that what you believe? Millis, yes, it is. Velasco, I assume you also believe that humanitarian aid is always morally correct. Millis, yes, I do. Velasco, can you see that sometimes humanitarian acts can be illegal? Millis, yes, I do. Velasco, and with respect to your beliefs about no more deaths and humanitarian aid, you're part of no more deaths because you don't think people should be dying or getting dehydrated or having problems in the desert, true? That is correct. Velasco, your view of things is that these people need water. Millis, yes, sure. Velasco, and in this scheme of things, as you see it, I'm not being critical, but as you see it, saving lives trumps the litter. Millis, that's the way I see it. Exactly right. To the question by his attorney as to whether, in quote, in this particular situation, had you determined that it was okay for you to litter, Millis responded that what we were doing was not littering. We were putting out water for folks that needed it, and we were actually picking up litter. So as His Honor had indicated, I do recognize that sometimes our humanitarian acts are interpreted by some as being illegal, but I do not believe that what we were doing that day was a crime. During the hearing, so actually a couple of years later, a year later, during the hearing surrounding the appeal before the Ninth Circuit, Ms. Anne Demarest, who was representing the government, took this last component of the exchange between Millis and Velasco as an admission that the water that he had left behind in the desert was indeed litter, and that the act of placing water was littering, and that was a crime, a Class B misdemeanor, as the court determined. Having established that the plastic jugs created the condition of possibility under which water could be placed in the desert, the bulk of the hearing was devoted to determine whether water could be garbage. So this is the defense attorney, Bill Walker. He opens the discussion. Now, the court knows in a criminal case we do follow the law of lenity, and that is that in this case the statute is to be strictly construed, and this is what the statute says. Did he litter? And by that we mean, did he dispose or dump garbage, refuse, sewage, sludge, earth, rocks, or other debris? That's it. There is no room for other things. In this case, as the court knows, the evidence was clear and undisputed. The defendant acknowledged his acts. He acknowledged that he did not, that what he did, and that is, he put sealed bottles of pure, clear water for migrants in distress. The question is, does that constitute littering? And we do not believe that it does. So Walker went on to say that the water jugs were not discarded, but placed out for migrants' consumption. And then he cited the U.S. versus Schneider case protecting First Amendment rights, in which leaflets were found not to be litter as they were being distributed, not only until the recipients discarded them, an act of which the person handing them out could not be found responsible. So the idea is, legal stuff, interesting. So Walker also argued that since there were no empty bottles found anywhere in the trail, and since these activists had collected all the other debris from as part of their activities, there was no evidence for littering. The greater part then of his argument was that these water jugs could not be seen as garbage because they were valuable, because they were life-saving. During the initial portion of the appeal, he had gone as far as to state that. And he says, this is still Walker arguing, "I do not believe that the government proves beyond reasonable doubt that this fits the definition of garbage or sludge or any of these other terms. This is life-sustaining water. It's sold in stores for valuable money, and if it was jewelry that would be put out there, I don't think anybody would claim that that was littering." So then the burden of proof fell on the government to prove that these water jugs fell within the definition of litter. So the assistant for the U.S. District Attorney faced the judges in the following exchange. So this is the U.S. District Attorney Assistant, Demarest. As the defense counsel states, he did not dispute that he put out water jugs in the wildlife refuge. He does not dispute that there is sufficient evidence to support the citation. His only argument is that he could not be cited as a matter of law because he attaches value to these plastic jugs. Judge Thomas. So there are 3 judges in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. You know the adage, one person's treasure is another one's trash. Exactly, Your Honor. And in these days, with recycling, anything could be of value. Judge McKeon. So anything could be garbage? If that suit you're wearing, is that garbage? Demarest, the attorney. If I took this off and I threw it in a national wildlife refuge, absolutely, Your Honor. McKeon, Judge McKeon. It would be garbage. And that is the definition of garbage? The attorney. Your Honor, there is no definition of garbage. The judge. So what are we looking at? Is everything garbage? Is this building garbage? If it's sitting here, if you could pick it up and move it out, would it be garbage? The attorney. I guess if you broke it up into pieces and you threw it out in a national wildlife refuge, it would be garbage. Judge McKeon, so you now have made a new definition about breaking it up and having, and in his view, he didn't break it up. He left the water in the jugs. One of our issues in the criminal cases, of course, is to interpret the language. So if you're saying that there is no definition of garbage, is that the government's position? The attorney, Your Honor, the district court looked at this. The district court looked at this in the district order, and it is not only an item that you look at. It is how it is disposed of, how it is displaced, where it is disposed of. The judge then, Thomas, I suppose, but I guess there's a common view in this, and the regulation could have been drafted to say, quote, if you leave any object in the refuge, but it says garbage. And I guess that most of us think of garbage as something other than a jug of pure water left for migrants coming through. The attorney, well, the regulation says more than that. It is debris. And Judge Thomas, but it is not debris. So, I don't know, I see the movement. Is my time ticking? Do I need to hurry up and finish? Okay, I'm moving here. So they're actually, so Millis is, it's on the far right. It's also part of the court exhibit. So when pushed back about the reasonableness of the rationale in which the defendant claimed that he was abandoning water in the desert, the attorney replied, the statutes that you talk about cannot leave stuff behind in a national wildlife refuge. Some of this stuff is oral, so the sentences are a bit awkward, right? And the problem is that if you come back on a different trail, what if someone gets it? What if you don't get it back? You cannot leave waters out in the wildlife refuge. It's pack in and pack out. So there's a question of abandonment, right? I mean, so is the act itself actually, when you put something out there, is, placing something out in a trail polluting? Is it the act of throwing it that, constitutes something into garbage, which is interesting. So, It strikes me that if you don't get back, the water jug will be the smallest of the problems, the smallest of the objects of littering in the desert. This kind of rationale that would put human concern, human well-being as a secondary consideration was made explicit by Desmarais in more than one occasion. So in this sense, if we think about the amount of people, the amount of debris, the amount of work, the amount of damage that is being done in the desert, if we're really thinking about protecting wildlife, water jugs are really kind of like a minuscule, a small portion of what's going on. So, so the attorney for the U.S. then actually had a chance to, to fully articulate her position, and since she says, but to address whether leaving water bottles in the desert is littering, the defendant relies on the argument that it isn't litter. It is pure, life-sustaining water. And as Your Honor went through, it kind of hit me, a nail on the head regarding this. In his mind, if it helps migrants in this matter, then it would not be litter. The government is saying, and we argue at trial, that placing those jugs out is litter. And I guess, in a weird sense, if you took life-sustaining water and pour it into the desert, you wouldn't be littering. The litter is in the bottle that the water is contained in, Judge, and not, in the substance itself. It is littering. I think that this was argued at the judgment of acquittal too, to Judge Velasco. The defense argued this. Judge Velasco had a lot of questions regarding this, and basically he denied their motion, finding that it was litter because it doesn't have a value. This is the reason for a wildlife refuge. It is a pristine area for plants and animals, and leaving these water bottles out doesn't provide any benefit to the wildlife refuge. Therefore, it is of no value, and it is debris as left. And then again, in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, she put it more succinctly, quote, this is a wildlife refuge, and is set for plants, animals, and the environment, and people come second. It is interesting that in the world that border politics make possible, environmental concerns can be quickly dismissed to install more fencing and build up more infrastructure, or they can be upheld to protect pseudo-pristine land and to place it as more important than water itself. And I think that you'll see in some of the other talks today how it is that environmental concerns and environmental regulations are, put in this kind of ping-pong game for border enforcement. So I would like to say a couple of things, and I want to change my, after thinking about some of this more specifically. Well, let me go back to this question. Let me give you this conclusion, and then we could probably talk about this in the Q&A. So, in closing, I would like to talk about this pithy little phrase, that I saw tattooed on all the walls of my city. I grew up in Guadalajara, a city that has with a severe, water crisis, and it was El agua es vida, water is life. And I think because what is at stake here is life itself, a politics of life itself. Ultimately, in this battle over the right to make water available, what is at stake is the differential value of life. Human life is rendered here at stake. I do not presume that the US government, as represented in this case or cases, sees water as garbage. But it is important to ask, what are the implications of having water depicted and used in this way? What does it mean that water that could save the lives of the individuals in an extremely precarious situation be construed as garbage and used to criminalize the actions of those who seek to reach across the legal, economic, and social political divides? What is at stake? What is at stake here is in many ways the status quo, the keeping of the divisions between those with rights and those whose rights can be bracketed, ignored, denied. Differential forms of recognition, differential claims to life lurk behind the effort to keep those who have access to water, to mobility, to jobs, to good conditions of life, away from those who can simply be let die in the vast silence of the desert. What is at stake here is the open formulation of the logic by which the power of the law can make live or let die, a formulation by Foucault. The risk in presenting water itself as polluting or incriminating is the alienation of water from its most fundamental relation to life itself. And this is also where I think Linton helps us think about what is water, and we can think about this question of hydrosocial relations, right, in a way that could be playful, perhaps productive. We must be wary of a world in which water becomes garbage, thirst, and also and then thirst becomes an inevitable way to die, and humanitarian intervention a crime. This increases the chasm not only between those who have water and those who die of thirst, but also between those whose lives count and merit protection and those whose lives are dispensable and always already exposed. Previous court challenges, which I don't have the time to go into here, had provided no more that's an opportunity to contest the legitimacy of a moral authority, of the moral authority of the U.S.'s policies that kill, and to establish a legal precedent that they hope would give the protection of life legal priority over territorial enforcement. The charges brought against Millis offer them another chance to set a precedent in the United States. This idea that humanitarian aid is never a crime, and those were the exact words of their campaign. The argument that this hopes to make at one point is that through these legal battles, civilian actors seek to do at least a couple of things. One, they seek to render visible the systematic duress to which migrants are exposed and which has now become part and parcel of an increasingly privatized border enforcement components. The kind of immigration process that we have is a result of very careful crafting. I mean, it's taken us 50 years or so to come up with this. So, I mean, so the goal is to make it visible, and hence all of the photographing of a lot of things. And the second point that they want to do is they seek to demarcate a political space for what they call civilian initiative, or the right they have as citizens of this country to actively work towards the fulfillment of the responsibilities that the U.S. has acquired. For instance, signing onto agreements. So in this battle, they see humanitarian interventions not just as moral obligations, but as their legitimate right. And then here the question becomes, what does it mean that in order for us to articulate our rights, we need a situation or scenario like this? So that's my talk today. Let me tell you how this ended. So the appeal was reversed. They were hoping at one point, I think there was a talk that, maybe we can make it to the Supreme Court. It would be kind of cool. So this is in a footnote where they actually explain. So there were two judges that voted to reverse the charges, and one who disagreed. And it was basically on the basis of the rule of lenity, which is basically on grammar. So these are the judges on the decision to reverse the charges, and it's a footnote where they explain this. We would have no problem affirming Millis's conviction if, as the dissent contends in section 27.4, prohibited littering in a wildlife refuge or disposing of or dumping of garbage, refuse, sewage, sludge, whatever. It is not that the text. However, that is not the text of the regulation. So the text of the regulation was not that the question here is like, what is garbage, right? Rather, the general prohibiting of litter governs the disposal of waste in subsection B. It requires, and this is actually cut and paste from the thing, it requires compliance with applicable sanitary provisions. In subsection A, it prohibits specifically the littering of garbage, right? Refuge, such sewage, sludge, earth, rocks, and other debris. So if he had said littering, comma, or the disposal of garbage, then he could have been found guilty. But because it was the littering of garbage, he was found that and because water could not be clearly seen as garbage, then the court was reversed. So this is how the legal case went, which also raises another interesting questions, right? I mean, so what does it mean to think about justice, for instance? So thank you for listening to me talk to this. Let's open it to, we have some time for questions. This is obviously work in progress, and I could tell you where some of the more conceptual work is going in terms of thinking about, border crossing as a condition and other things. But I think it's really interesting to see the actual workings of some of these cases. Any questions? And thank you for coming so early, all of you. I just looked up and saw you. Yes.
Have you found out if anyone has poison in the water?
Oh, yeah, that has been a concern. Evil concern. A lot of this, a lot of the water that migrants are drinking after the first day is what they find in cattle tanks. So a lot of the migrants then develop, diarrhea, which kills them, right? So there's this question as to poison, water that could be poisonous or water that can actually kill. Diarrhea being a huge, it exacerbates dehydration and makes it really a problem. For the big water barrels, the humanitarians, they test the water, they do a pH test with the water, and they also throw in chlorine tablets. Sometimes they throw so many of those, or a little one goes a long way. So you arrive at the tank and it's like, wow, this is like pool water. You've smelled it. So it's been one of the concerns, but it's not been something that has at least come to the surface in terms of cases. The idea of it being that some water would be better than no water. The other problem with this is also that this water is very, very hot. It's room temperature or whatever, outdoor temperature, and so it's a so what you're getting is basically water that would be ready to do tea, right? So it's it doesn't, let me go back to some of these images. It doesn't solve the conditions that lead to this, to this situation, right? So once you, let's think about this. This is very effective. I like to think about, I've been thinking about these deaths as, this is not necessarily conceptually been thinking about this idea of accidents. Not because they're accidental deaths. We foresaw, it was foreseen that people would, walk across more dangerous parts. It was foreseen that there would be a hike in the criminal, I could, share the documents with you, that there would be a hike in criminal activity, that people would take, greater risks, and greater risks translate into actual, consequences. So, what's interesting about this is that this is not necessarily the policy being successful. When the policy is successful, people get detained a few times before they eventually make it across, or some people will eventually, it would take the policy at its face value, people would eventually be deterred from crossing and would go back home. Some of them do, a very small percentage. When the policy fails, which is the discourse that we're used to thinking about, people make it through, right? They might suffer a little bit along the way, but they make it through. This doesn't quite explain these deaths. I've been thinking about these deaths in terms of what Paul Birillo calls accidents. And he says that, he thinks about technologies, and he says about ships, for instance. We can learn much more about a ship by looking at a shipwreck than by looking at a ship. So this is a shipwreck of the policy, right? This is not what was supposed to happen. But I'm interested then in how is it that it becomes sustainable. We're going on 2 decades of this. So this is what the bulk of my work, is trying to address. How is it that we have come to find this way of doing immigration to the U.S. morally, socially, politically acceptable? So the question is about, can water kill you in terms of being poisoned? There are other things that are doing the job, right? And there are other things that are that is problematic in many ways. But some people do damage things. No, not enough to actually poison it.
I'm sorry, one other question. The bottles of water, the gallons, are they taken back once they're empty, or they're just left there?
There's a lot of recycling that is done, and actually to the chagrin of a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, who's now doing archaeological work on this, these groups have actively been. This is one of the things that they give back. So they go out into the desert, they put water, or they look for migrants in distress, and then they will do either organized systematic cleanups, or they will at least collect water. So one of the things that they take out in the desert is a string. So they are stringing bottles as they come out. Right before coming into Tucson, there's a recycling place. So there's a very systematic effort to recycle this debris that has been documented by a ton of journalists who go with them. Yes, Juanita. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for your time. I've been really interested in the issue of littering. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the relationship to the so-called littering of the humanitarian organizations and the politics of the so-called litter that undocumented migrants leave that Jason De Leon writes about. Have you thought about how those two kinds of littering are conceptualized and related to each other?
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot about the question of when is it that things are considered disposable? And that it also applies to people, right? Under what conditions are people considered disposable? And the process by which things become wasted, or the wasting away. So, what's interesting to me here is that ultimately the way that we define rights or whatnot, I mean, really comes down at the level of such specific technicalities, right? And life is in the background. And it's like, yeah, this water saves lives. We know that. We know that you think that, yeah. And so I'm really fascinated by, on the one hand, this conceptual understanding that people are dying in the desert, and at the same time, the refusal, the neglect, the conditions by which people would continue to be, even if people don't die, the amount of damage that is done by doing this, the fact that we would do this that we would, turn our immigration system and do this, to me is interesting. So this wasting away of people, this disposing of people is one of the things that I'm conceptually interested in. I'm still working the kinks of how this talk is connected to that, but to me, I think that we have a couple of parallel tracks here. On the one hand, this talking about water as life-saving, and I initially wrote the paper for a conference on water rights, I have to say. So I presented with all of these people from Cochabamba, and we're talking about, we have to have, don't privatize our water. And I was like, well, I'm going to talk about gallons. It's actually 25 gallons of water. There were 25 gallons that were actually either taken out of the trails or confiscated from the back of a milice's truck. 25 gallons that, created this interesting situation. So, and I think that we and the people, these are water experts from throughout the world, and they were kind of looking at me funny. It's like, water is garbage, it doesn't make any sense. But so I'm interested in, what is it about the border that can create conditions in which you can do this kind of stuff that would seem nonsensical elsewhere, Or that would seem like death marches, like, no, we don't do those. But then we have this that is kind of hyper-documented. So how is it that we create this exceptional space where the dark magic happens, right? Any other questions? Yes, let me take the turn.
I like your presentation. I guess the findings you were reporting here pushed us to think about a big question. That is how the U.S. can strive to maintain a secure border at the same time a humane border, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a very tough balance. And I was also wondering, if today your presentation is at the Border Patrol Office here, what might be some of their comments? You might be saying, this might not only be the issue of littering.
Yeah.
This could also be the issue of national security.
Yeah.
In the sense, you might be saying that we're trying our best to patrol the border to deter undocumented immigration to this nation. And then we have individuals who are doing this. They have their own rationale from military concern, but they're trying to say, these kind of activities not only might be associated with littering, but also you're doing something that could potentially invite undocumented immigrants.
Absolutely.
So my question to you is, how would you respond to that?
I would say stay for throughout the conference. I have so many questions, and I have, and I liked your feedback on a lot of stuff. I do talk to some agents, but they tend to be like, one agent at a time. So it would be fantastic to actually have the formal positions of things. There are a couple, it's I like to think of the fence as a facade, and I play with this idea of like, fence as facade, alliteration, Jay Komarov, you would be so happy. My advisor. So the thing about security has become a really kind of interesting dynamic. Borders were never meant to absolutely work as impermeable, barriers. They were basically, there to demark jurisdiction. And this new vision that we have of boundaries as, uncrossable, which is actually not what we want to do, is relatively new. There's so many ways to actually tackle this question. This migration from Mexico to the U.S. has been systematic, it's old. There are fantastic photos that Jorge Bustamante, who's now the UN representative for migration, who's been working on the Tijuana-Mexico border, has. In the early 80s, border patrol agents dressed as Santa Claus going to Smuggler's Gulch, where people are like kind of waiting to cross. There's someone making like tortillas or sopitos, and they're like giving out toys, right, for the kids. Exceptional, it's Christmas, right? It was Christmas. We cannot think of that in the contemporary moment, right? But if we can kind of bracket the contemporary and think about, so what was the relationship before that would make that kind of thing kind of cool to do, kind of acceptable, that would actually, the Border Patrol Union, would do a toy drive and say, here comes the kids. So there's obviously something that is different going on here. And there's this question that defense equals security, and security is such a fantastic category because what is security? What is security really? Security works as a project. Security works as something that you never do, but you're always working. It's like a treadmill, right? I mean, you're always in the process of achieving. Once we talk about security and insecurity is the same things. It's a possibility that something might happen. Once something happens, we talk about specific events and incidents. And the kinds of interventions that you do for specific, incidents is very different than what you do for security. So as a national project is kind of interesting. To talk about how this is, just briefly, mobilize this. I was asked to do a presentation at the University of Michigan last year, and 3 days before my presentation, I'm listening to NPR in the morning, and it's like, there's a new report coming out from Congress, commissioned by a couple of congressmen, and that has found that the Canadian-American border is insecure. There are only 150 miles of fence and 4,000 miles of border. It's like, so the definition of insecurity is a lack of fencing. It's like, I didn't know that border had a security issue, a security problem, right? But now the question is like, it has no fencing, we have to securitize it, we have to invest on it, which, I have another talk that I could do sometime in which I talk about the cost of fencing. And when it runs, anything between, $800,000 a mile to $20 million a mile, and you have many, many miles of this, and when fencing expires, in 20 years or so, this is a huge business. And when the US has been outsourcing this, and when these companies have tremendous lobbying power in DC, and when migrants are seen as this outsider others, so there is an endless apparently supply of them that we can continue to dispose of them. We have found the perfect business, right? Not to undermine to me it's really interesting that in this question of there's a triple threat when it comes to the border: drugs, people, immigrants, and then terrorists. Terrorists doesn't really come through. The drugs, we've decided that that's a war we cannot win, so we go after the busboys, right? Because they're easy. So.
Well, I think we're going to have to move along. We have time for one quick question.
Yes.
I was just wondering how much diversity there is in the way that the federal law enforcement agencies and then the patchwork of law enforcement agencies at the state and local level all across the border deal with this.
Sheriff Estrada from Nogales, an old-timer, likes to say that Nogales is the safest town in America because, for every resident there are like 4 law enforcement. The combination is huge, right? I mean, so you have, typically when you have, raids or whatever else, you would have a rainbow coalition. So you have not only they call it the law enforcement rainbow coalition, right? Isn't that the term? So you would have local. So there's a series of different jurisdictions. So you have different police departments. You would have the sheriff's departments. You would have CIA, FBI, Border Patrol, BORTEC, Customs and Border Enforcement, which deal with other things. So it's really a combination of people. This also creates interesting problems when it comes to counting, and because they have different jurisdictions, right? So there's also the question as to who intervenes, how do we count, for instance, deaths, or who do you call, right? I mean, and also it's growing. There are entire new communities. I mean, I recently stayed in Sahuarita, and a kind of gated community where a friend moved into, whose husband used to work for Dawn Autumn. And going to the gym in the gated community was like, wow, it's like, so many different agencies, right? I mean, there's, at any given time, you can have, 12, 15 agencies represented. Tobacco and Firearms being another one who does border work. We can talk more about this. Sorry, convoluted question.
We could talk more about this, and we will. And I want to, please, let's extend our